There was an interesting announcement this week to do with carbon capture and storage. Some say it could be a fantastic solution to the future. Others just trying to keep coal and gas in the system when it shouldn't be there. Mark McCallum from COAL21, the Chief Executive Officer, joins me now in the studio for more on this. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Tom.
So a couple of things this week. One was an announcement to provide more money for a carbon capture storage project in Queensland. It does rely on federal money though as well. So where's that at?
So at the moment we've got negotiations going on right now with industry consortium, with researchers and with COAL21 as well, and discussions with the Australian government as well around supporting a new carbon capture hub up in Queensland, which would essentially unlock an ability for industries up in Queensland to use a common user infrastructure, pipelines, injection site, and also a demonstration of carbon capture from a coal-fired power station up in Queensland as well.
Talk us through that project. So it's a site where it would be based at where there's a coal production site, but it could be used by other industries as well?
So the site itself is with the CTSCO project, which is the Carbon Transport Storage Company's project, and we're looking to help support it and fund it off the Millmerran Power Station. And what that will do is capture around 25,000 cars worth of emissions every year for the next 25 years off that power station, and it separates out the CO2 and purifies the CO2 out of the waste stream, and then we can put that CO2 into the Earth's crust, around 2.5 kilometres into the Earth's crust. But the infrastructure we do have to use to do that injection can be used by other industries up in that region, so by the natural gas industry, by other coal producers, even industrial processes such as fertiliser or cement manufacture. So it really unlocks an ability for those industries in Queensland to lower their carbon emissions.
So, and that process, so it can be pumped into the Earth's crust. I understand as well it can even be used for helping production of beer and soft drink and so on.
Yeah, you can use it for all sorts of industrial processes.
If it goes into the Earth's crust, is there any risk about that getting back into the atmosphere at some stage?
No, we put it into the Earth's crust around 2.5 kilometres down into the Earth's crust, and this is not new technology. This is technology that's been around for 40 odd years and being used around the world right now to capture emissions and put emissions back into deep storage sites. And those deep storage sites are using saline water, so salt water, and the CO2 when it's stored is actually quite sticky. It doesn't flow like water, it doesn't move around like water, it sticks to the rock, stays to the rock, so and largely stays put.
While this is, let's say while this is attached and working within with the coal-fired power plant, what's the overall cost for energy in terms of the energy when you combine the CO2 aspect and the coal? What's the cost we're talking about?
So the cost of capture for carbon capture have come down significantly. So 10 years ago it would have been around $100 a tonne for capture. And there are projects now that you're looking at $30, $35 a tonne. So for our little project, it's merely a single unit that we seek to expand over time. So we hope to grow it into a commercial scale operation. So in its own right, no, it's not economic, but we'll de-risk the opportunity for others to come in and to utilise that infrastructure.
So that's the key part about the economics of it, right? So when you think of this as, I understand you can say you can use it for other industries, when you think of it being used for coal, at the moment, if you've got a straight up renewable project, that's still cheaper than coal with this add-on?
No, so we've done, if you look at Queensland and the opportunity in Queensland and the storage sites that are there, we've modelled capturing brand new power stations with CCS at full capacity of storage, so 90% capture, would still come in under the price that you're currently paying for power in Queensland and in Victoria and in New South Wales.
Queensland's pretty expensive power at the moment. What are you saying the cost would be in the kilowatt hour?
Under $100 a megawatt hour.
Right.
Yeah, so under Angus Taylor's current targets of, he's got a target around $70 a megawatt hour at the moment, and we'd be looking at for 45% capture would be around that target of 70.
45% capture?
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
on a brand new energy system.
But that's 45% capture, so that's still 55% emissions going.
But for 90%, you can then offset 90% with biosequestration or other means and offset the emissions of the remaining 10%.
If you think of energy and so on, scrap the ideology and think of it as a technology race instead. At the moment, you do have renewable energy projects that come under that cost, and they've obviously got production costs for everything, but they've got zero emissions, whereas you're saying you've still got a 55% emissions of the
10%,
coal.
Yes.
But how are you going in the technology race? Because a lot of people will point to a lot of different projects out there within renewables and say, well, they're already cheaper than that. So
it's been slower than we would have liked, obviously, and
on CCS.
On CCS. But the fact is that the IPCC and the IEA all look to CCS as an important part of the solution. So renewables are definitely part of the solution, but you can't get to the +2 degrees, let alone to the +1.5 degrees, without CCS, without extracting those emissions and capturing those emissions from existing sources like power stations or steel mills or other industry, then there's not an ability for the world currently to meet those targets.
Ability or desire? I mean, I guess, so what you're saying sort of speaks to what the IPCC is talking about in a recent release, the production gap. How much fossil fuel usage we're on track for versus what we need to do. It's not that it's an impossibility to reduce it, but the willingness isn't there. So you're saying there are a lot of countries that keep wanting to use fossil fuels. If they're going to do that, we'll need CCS.
Yeah, and I think that's the really exciting part of this project and this announcement this week, Tom, is further funding to make sure that we get this project up and running, to get projects that capture CO2 from industry in Queensland and do something with that CO2, either in storage or, as you said before, industrial uses for CO2 are increasing as well. So into food, into manufacturing sector, into abattoirs, even for enhanced oil recovery processes, you can actually use the CO2, so it has some value then as well.
Right. Does that necessarily mean there's going to be a long future for coal specifically, because we know the power stations take a while to fire up, and that's an issue with the grid. We know as well, coal mining in of itself is pretty dirty. It's not great for the landscape. There's a lot of rehabilitation work that goes in. That CCS might take off of its own accord, but coal might not necessarily be there for many decades?
Well, that's the thing, is trying to find a solution for all industrial emissions, whether it be from coal power stations, whether it be from natural gas power stations or other emitters of industry. Without a storage solution and without a use for the CO2, then the challenge to meet the +2 degrees targets, it becomes really much harder.
If you look at the name of the company, COAL21, I mean, the implication is there's a desire to keep coal going. Is there anything wrong if we do get technology that CCS might work with industry and renewables become fantastic and batteries are cheap, that we leave stuff in the ground?
We had an interesting discussion around hydrogen, for instance, very recently, and Alan Finkel and his national hydrogen strategy. And to look at the ability to produce hydrogen and the opportunity that would create for Australia, for another export market, is fantastic. And you can actually make hydrogen from many sources. You can make it from vegetation, you can make it from water, you can make it from natural gas, and you can make it from coal. And if you have coal with CCS, you actually pull off all the emissions, all the CO2 production. So it would be the equivalent of a green hydrogen solution and a blue hydrogen solution have the same emissions. So the same product going to the same consumer, produced in two different ways. And why would Australia not want to entertain both ways if one's more affordable than the other?
So that's the key, right? If it's an affordability race...
and it's the same outcome on emissions.
Coal with CCS has to sink or swim on its cost versus renewables, and you're happy to go, well, if coal loses that race, fair enough, we're on renewables. If it wins, you'd like to keep it going. Is that where we're at?
I think if you can remove the emissions, then you shouldn't demonise the commodity.